Hey guys, a few of you put on the chat this week that you want more support in how to answer questions, how to structure your answers. So this is just a little video to go through how you actually structure those points. And we have done this a number of times before, but it's just a recap for you in case any of you need it for support over the summer. So a paragraph is split up into two separate mark systems, KAA, or knowledge, application and analysis, and evaluation. Now these are really easy to do, okay, the structure I'm going to show you, but you do need to practice it. Most students go into the exam with really similar levels of knowledge, but their ability to actually write it down is the difference between a C grade student getting an A, okay, or an A grade student getting a C. So this isn't hard, but it does take a bit of practice, okay? So what we're going to use is a peel paragraph. Point, example, explain and link, okay? So to actually do this paragraph well, you have to show K, which is knowledge, A, which is application, and A, which is analysis. And I've put in pink the point, the example, and the explain to show you what each of those things mean. So the first thing you always start your paragraph with is your point. What is the point you're making? What is the thing you are going to say in the paragraph? Okay, so in one sentence, point out exactly what you're going to be saying. So here I've put e.g. at times of recession, the government should increase government debt. So I've made a statement, and the rest of my paragraph is going to be explaining that statement. The second thing you do is you give an example of when that happened. What you're showing the examiner here is that you're not making it up, that you understand that this theory that you think is true has been seen elsewhere. And in class, I will have described this to you as when I was a solicitor, I had to back up my opinion about the law with case study or statute. I wasn't just able to say, oh, well, this should happen or that should happen. I had to back up as an example to qualify, to illustrate, to give weight, validity to my argument. Okay, so here, I've put here the example. So give an example that qualifies, proves your point. E.g., at the start of the coronavirus pandemic, the UK government borrowed billions of pounds to pay and furlough UK workers. So already I've said the point, government should spend in a recession, and I've qualified it by saying in the UK, that's what they did. Now, again, this is one sentence. So one sentence for point, one sentence for example. Now we're going to get onto the meaty bit, or the explain. Okay, this is the why. This is where you explain the theory or diagrams or key terms. You need to write 3 to 4 full sentences, each sentence fully explained. To write the change, you should use words or phrases like this affects, which leads to, which has an impact on, therefore. These terms indicate small logical steps detailing how one variable affects another. To fully explain these points, top students use words like because, such as, to explain why the variable affects each other. So what you're doing through the explain bit is you are using small jumps to explain how one variable affects another. So we do this in class by me saying C increases, increase AD, increase GDP. Now those are the logical steps. Increase in C, increase in AD, increase in GDP. That's the step, okay? The hop along. That's the chain analysis. But what you've got to do to get an A is really explain the why. So why is it that an increase in consumption affects AD? Why is it that an increase in AD affects GDP? So that's where you're using the words like because, that's where you're using your diagram. So we want small steps, not big jumps, and we want them fully explained. So I've got an example here, and what you'll see as I'm reading through is actually I've only got 3 chains, okay? I'm only making 3 points, But because of the fact they're fully explained, the paragraph looks really, really long. And that's because it's about the depth and not the quantity of points that you're making. So really in an essay, you might be looking at maybe 4 points. Short or answer questions, you might only be looking at 2. But it's the quality of what you write that's so, so important. Okay, and this is what takes the practice. This is what students find more difficult. Okay, this was because the UK government realised that UK consumption would fall considerably and employment would fall during the pandemic. This was because businesses were shut, such as hospitality. This would lead to mass unemployment from a fall in consumption, leading to a large contraction in aggregate demand. AD going from AD to AD1 and GDP from Y to Y1. And I've got my diagram showing that. This would affect standards of living and prosperity for the UK. This borrowing has an effect on supporting consumption, hoping to reduce the fall in aggregate demand, supporting employment and standards of living. AD only falls to AD2 and Y2. So I've used 3 sentences, 3 chains, okay? This was because, they borrowed to support consumption. Why? Then this would stop mass unemployment, and then explaining why that happens, because it would stop AD falling as far as it would have fallen. Okay, I've used words like because all the way through, I've used key terms, and I've got my diagrams in there. Okay, now most of the time you're expected to write an evaluation as well, which is showing the where your point falls down. So in class, I will describe this to you by saying, what you're trying to do is work out where the weakness in your argument lies. So as I said to you in class, when I used to go into court as a solicitor, I would often know where the weakness in my client's case was, and I would try and skillfully move them away or move the CPS away from realising where the weakness in the case was, because I knew that that's where they would be found guilty. So what you're doing is you are showing that you realise that there are caveats or there are flaws or there are weaknesses in your case. And if you think about it, as an economic consultant, that's what you'd be expected to do. You'd be expected to put together a list of arguments for a government, for a firm. But then you would be expected to say, however, this is where your arguments are weaker, or this is where the dodgy bits lie. Because that is where your opposition would attack your points. So it's really important that you understand where the logic starts to fall down. So how to write an evaluation? Okay, so to write an evaluation, you are trying to identify the issues in your argument where they are weak. And that can come from a number of different ways. So it might come from different economic viewpoints, which is what I'm going to look at next. It could come from assumptions that you've made. It could come from the fact that ceteris paribus, not everything remains the same, or we're at different situations. So for every given point, there may be thousands of evaluation points which you can make. And in the exam, you can all write completely different answers from each other, and they all be equally as right because you've looked at them in different ways. That's why it's really quite useless asking people what did they put in the exam, because what you've put and what they've put could be totally different but be worth exactly the same mark. So really stay away from that, particularly in writing subjects. It's obviously a bit different in maths and stuff like that. So in evaluations, you will look at things like, points to make for evaluation is the length of evaluation should be the same as the initial point. And if I was going to say one thing that my students last year were working towards, it hadn't cracked right at the end of the year, it was this point. You've got to make sure your evaluation is the same length. It's got to be really in-depth because this is worth a significant number of marks. You've got to use your chain analysis and words like because, and you've got to use examples and diagrams. They make the best ones. And it must relate to the original point. It must not just be the opposite. It's really important that, because as examiners, we are trained to look for this. If it's not an evaluation of the original point, if it's just against it, then it becomes what we call KAA. It's just another point and there is no evaluation that can be given. Now, I've chosen a really different point to use here now because I want to do a bit of learning with you, because this is something we haven't covered yet. The other classes in first year have covered it, but unfortunately I hadn't covered it. I always cover it right at the end of the year because of lockdown, and I don't want to teach it online because I think it will confuse some of you. But I've decided to just run it through now as an evaluation point. There are lots more evaluations we could have used here, which I'm going to go through in a minute. Some of you may have read this in Anderton already, which I felt that's why I wanted to go through it now. Okay, so, however, not all governments borrow at times of recession. Classical economists believe that when a government borrows to spend in such a way, it creates further debt and higher costs in the future, which in fact will be no increase in GDP. Here, if the government was to borrow to increase aggregate demand, it would shift AD to AD1, increasing GDP to Y1. And there is a greater demand for factors of production, they start to ask for higher wages. And so the short and aggregate supply curve shifts to SRAS1. Firms employ less as they are too expensive. The short and aggregate supply will shift to SRSA1, and at this point, prices in the economy are high and real GDP is the same. This has an effect on exports and standards of living. As their goods are more expensive. Classical economists therefore believe government spending will increase prices and make no increase in output. So this is an evaluation point in my original point, because it's saying that actually classical economists have a different viewpoint, that actually if governments spend more, then all will happen is prices will rise and there'll be no increase in GDP. So this is evaluating the original point because it's saying it will not happen. I could have used other points though. So I could have said ceteris paribus, will everything else remain the same, okay? Or what other impacts are likely to be happening. So I could have talked about the state of the markets. I could have talked about how much it's going to cost the government to borrow. I could have referred to those issues in relation to the government borrowing at the time of the pandemic. Does it really matter what the government spends the money on? So if the government spends the money on things which are completely useless or aren't going to support the economy during times of the pandemic, then that might be a really bad idea for governments to spend the money. Say, for example, the government spent millions and millions of pounds on the Nightingale centres, which thankfully weren't really needed as much as what they were feared by the government. But you could argue that the money spent on those Nightingale centres didn't really support the economy. However, money spent on furloughing people, allowing employees to maintain some level of consumption, was a good idea. But was it such a great idea to maybe support people who were under the age of 18? I mean, how many of you actually received 8% of your wages whilst working at McDonald's? Really, was that an important use of government money? Really, was that? Should the government really have been spending that money? It might have been okay for people who may be over the age of 21 that had families, they were furloughed. But really, was it okay to furlough 16-year-olds? Do 16-year-olds really need to be paid for by the government in that way? Okay, because there was a lot of those people that were furloughed and paid like that because you came under those characteristics, those criteria. It might have been okay for you, but was it okay for the government? Was it okay for the economy? So, just to recap, the evaluation is not the opposite. It is why your initial point is not correct or weaknesses in it. Okay. Here I've looked at a different viewpoint, but more likely, it's going to be why the point that you've made won't always carry. Okay, maybe it might be okay for the UK government in time of pandemic, but it wouldn't have been okay in a normal recession. This is abnormal set of circumstances, and you can't use those same set of circumstances through other recessions. So, for example, it would be crazy to suggest that the government steps in at times of recession to support employment in this way again. So, for example, in the financial crisis, there was no way a government would have stepped in. We had a Labour government at the time, and they didn't even do something like this. So this is really exceptional and really wouldn't be relevant in other sets of characteristics in other times. So, just to recap, when you're structuring your paragraph, you're going to do PEE and then a final E for evaluation. You're going to make your point, sentence. You're going to give me an example to show why you think your point, sentence. Then you're going to use small steps for explanation. You're going to explain to me your point using diagrams, using theory. You're going to have 3 to 4 chains, and you're going to be using words like because. Then for evaluation, what you're saying here is, why is it that your point doesn't make sense? What is it about your point which is weak? Where are the problems in your argument? Okay, hope that's all right, because I did notice a few of you had said weaknesses in understanding how to structure examples. So to put something out straight away, so you've got something there and you can start to work on. You've got your green books that you can be using to have a look at data and to practice doing these type of questions. Okay.